Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here and being asked to do this professorial lecture. Can I check you can hear me okay at the back? I do have the microphone on, thanks. If my voice drops, let me know. So thank you to Elizabeth and John for these kind remarks. And what I'm going to do is talk about work that I have done over the years in both universities in Aberdeen, and then finish with a little bit of the work I'm doing here now. And I'm going to talk about this topic about non-technical skills. It might be familiar. How many people know this term non-technical skills or use it in their work? Quite a few people. And then other people who I assume weren't going to know anything about this. And I'm going to explain the background to this and kind of how I got into working in this particular area of research, which Elizabeth says is I started to work with the oil industry when I was first in the business school about a year before Piper Alpha exploded. And I'll refer to some of that work as I go through. So I've called this presentation The Right Stuff, and that's because this is part of the kind of history of where this comes from. And this term, the right stuff, some of you may have read the book or seen the film, which was about partly about Chuck Yeager, the pilot who first broke the sound barrier, who was deemed to have had the right stuff. And the right stuff was also the characteristics that were being needed for the very first astronauts in programs like the Mercury and Apollo programs. But the issue with the right stuff, and what was the right stuff for flying a single-seat fighter jet or being, a very high-risk test pilot, transpired might not, in fact, be the right stuff for the aircraft that were coming on stream in the 1970s, late 70s, 80s, bigger jet aircraft, a crew of 3 in those days, an engineer as well as the 2 pilots, and people having to work in a different kind of way in these complex aircraft. And what, in fact, in some of the writing about this area, and at this time, was that characteristics that were the right stuff for being, as I say, a single-seat fighter pilot, very autocratic, not needing to listen to anybody else. There was no team there essentially to work with. Those behaviours in a team of 3 on a different kind of modern commercial aircraft of its day were shown to be some of the wrong behaviours for keeping the flight safe. And in fact, the right stuff, as we're looking at it now, and from the work we've been doing, is focused very much on human behaviour. How people think about the tasks they're doing, how they plan them, how they make decisions, how they work with other people in the team. Behaviour is affected by personality, but this is much more the behaviours that you can choose. Whatever personality you have, you can choose to behave one way or another, and it's trying to identify what those behaviours are. So this is really all about safety. And the background, and those of you who know about CRM or CRM being crew resource management, the training of the non-technical skills, may be aware of these accidents. So the seminal one in Europe was the Tenerife accident, where the 2 jumbo jets hit each other on the runway. No technical failures, a complex day for various reasons I won't go into, but it was an accident that showed that failures in things to do with team working and communication and decision making had really contributed to that accident. This is the late 70s, and about the same time the Americans have 3 accidents, one after the other, where there's no primary technical failure, and they begin to realize they're going to have to look at pilot behavior and how the crews work together and how the crews make decisions while they're flying the aircraft. And they begin to bring in at that time work to identify what the non-technical skills are, these behaviour patterns that are either protective for safety or are making the flight more risky, and they bring in this form of training they call crew resource management. That's what I'm going to talk about here. The big companies bring this in. Some of them have psychologists, they begin to develop stuff, but not everybody, because it hasn't been mandated. And it's not till 1989 we see the accident, some of you may remember, at Kegworth, where the pilots have one engine on fire, it's a 2-engine plane. Planes can fly on one of those engines safely. But the pilots accidentally then shut down the good engine, and now the plane has no engines, and we have this dreadful crash. And there's a number of contributing factors there, which I won't go into, but at this point, the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK took the view that there were so many of these events, particularly this one, where aspects of human error that were contributing to the accidents, that they would have to bring in mandated training on non-technical skills. This crew resource management training would have to come in for all commercial pilots. And that was quite a big step, that this psychological work on behaviour was now going to become part of the training and the licensing for this very technical group of people. And the kind of framework then we're looking at here is when we're trying to look at, ultimately we're trying to look at job performance. I'm in a business school, I've been in a psychology department looking at the same thing, and I'm particularly interested in what makes safe and efficient performance, and that's of interest to many people, irrespective of what kind of job you've got. And the piece I'm interested in is this piece around the non-technical skills, and we have to acknowledge that there's other things affect our behaviour at work. What's the culture like? Is everybody taking risks? Do people cut corners? Do people do things carefully? Do people have enough time? Is the equipment good? All those factors. And I'm not going to go into that, but obviously the culture and the work conditions have a part to play. And we have done research on hospitals in Scotland and oil platforms in the North Sea looking at these cultural factors. But the bit I'm going to talk about here is just this non-technical bit. But what I'm trying to say here is I don't just think when things go wrong it's the fault of the worker. I think it's also factors to do with management and the organisation as well, which are in that big box. But the piece I'm going to concentrate here is the bit that's to do with the worker, which are these non-technical skills. And this is a sort of list of what these skills are. So situational awareness is about picking up information, making sense of it, anticipating what might happen next. Very important in aviation, very important in a lot of other jobs. Making decisions while you're on task. Team working, but not necessarily just looking at how the team you work with in a given situation work. It means teamwork skills for whatever team you find yourself in that day. So in aviation, the pilots in the big airlines, they don't fly with the same people every day. In other workplaces like hospitals, you won't necessarily be working with exactly the same team in the ward or the operating theatre every day. So you need to know enough about team behaviour and your behaviour in a team and how your behaviour affects other people to work in whatever team you find yourself in when you come on shift. And so we talk about portable team skills you can take with you into whatever team you find yourself in. Leadership, communication, and also things to do with managing stress and fatigue, because they will affect those other factors. And stress and fatigue are quite common in a lot of these high-risk workplaces, high reliability, they might prefer to be called. They're working shifts, they might be working rotas, they might be working in areas where they've got jet lag because they're having to travel. So those factors are not uncommon. So this slightly odd term, non-technical skills, I think is in what we might call European English. It comes from the European civil aviation. It's a bit of a cumbersome term. When we started to work with the surgeons, they kept saying, why do we have to have this ridiculous non-technical term? I said, basically because the train has already left the station on this. This is already on the literature. This is what they're calling it in the industry where this started, and it's 20 years, 30 years down the line in that industry. So that we all know that we're talking about the same thing, I think we need to stay with the same terminology. So it's a funny kind of terminology. Although my experience working in this area as a psychologist is that sometimes people think you want to work on what engineers will call soft skills, or they might call them psychological skills, or things to do with kind of soft and fuzzy behaviours. And this isn't very helpful when you're trying to work in highly technical domains with highly technical people, I have found. I have tried to get engineers to stop using the term soft skills because people don't always find these behaviours entirely easy. And I think the word, I began to realise working with the pilots, we were working with European pilots, that the term non-technical seemed to land okay because it has the word technical in it. And these are technical people working in a technical environment, and they were sort of okay with this. So I suspect this may also have applied to surgeons and oilmen and others that we've worked with. So the non-technical skills are these thinking skills and teamwork skills. They call this crew resource management. And in aviation, they train and assess these skills regularly. And I was lucky enough to be part of a project, a European project, working with Dutch and German and French psychologists and pilots a few years ago when I was at the business school in those days, identifying a kind of system of non-technical skills. The big airlines had these, but the regulators were concerned that the smaller airlines, the charter airlines, the Eastern European airlines didn't have the resources to develop these. And we worked on a project that had a kind of pan-European system of identifying the main categories and then deconstructing these into the component elements and then working out what were the good and poor behaviours. And if you want to identify non-technical skills, and you think about whatever job you're in, whether it's an academic job or an industry job or some kind of business application, if you want to take a particular role and work out, so what are the key thinking skills, teamwork skills, leadership skills, skills for coping with stress and fatigue? There are, in aviation, lots of good sources of information for doing this, and we were able to work with these. So they do a lot of what's called task analysis, which is examining the components of the job with interviews. They used simulators very early on, and the simulators are wonderful for psychologists being able to watch behaviour and understand what works and what doesn't work. They did surveys, they had confidential reporting systems, but one of the really strong things they had was the cockpit voice recorders. And they still have these, and they're still very important. So we can hear on a loop what the pilots are saying in the moments before something happens, or an hour before something happens if this is a slow evolving event. And these data, you know how hard they work to try and find the black box that's got this cockpit voice recorder in it so that they can understand what has gone on. And these have been really, really valuable for the psychologists, being able, along with pilots, to listen to what was happening. This is an example just of the kind of thing that was being revealed in these recordings. It's an older accident. This is a plane that crashed into the Potomac River in Washington in very icy conditions, an Air Florida plane. The pilot's not terribly used to flying, I think, in these very cold and icy conditions, and don't need to read the technical blur, but the little bit of conversation here from the tape began to reveal, and this is in the 1980s, began to reveal behaviour patterns that they became very concerned about, and they began to develop training for. This is the first officer, the co-pilot, not quite happy with something. I think it's something to do with the speed. And the captain saying, yes, it says there's 80. First officer says, no, I don't think it's right. Maybe it is. Not confident, not assertive, but not happy and not confident that everything is correct on this particular takeoff. Captain says 120, I think he's reading speed, and the first officer is replying on the tape, I don't know. And he is trying to tell the captain that he's concerned. And this should be, for the captain, a big red flag that maybe they need to just have a little bit of rethink about what is going on here, but they don't. And then this happens. And so a whole lot of experiments were being done about co-pilots who were hesitant to speak up and challenge captains, and also captains who weren't terribly receptive to be listening to co-pilots. This is a study, a psychologist I know well, Judith Orisanu at NASA, who did very interesting work on how do pilots make decisions while they're in flight, and they had simulators at NASA for studying this. But this is a paper and pencil study with pilots where They have a scenario here that's given to either captains or co-pilots, and they have to imagine that if they're a captain, they're talking to a co-pilot, and if they're a co-pilot, they have to imagine they're talking to a captain. And they're just simply asked in this study, what would they say in this situation to the other pilot? And what they found was the pattern in the data showed that the captains were very direct to the co-pilots. If they weren't comfortable with what the co-pilot was doing, they would say, turn 30 degrees right. No, if, but, maybe, very direct statement. But the first officers, the co-pilots, in the same situation, trying to give the same signal, were doing hinting behaviours. So instead of saying turn, they would say things like, that return at 25 miles looks mean, which actually is a lot more information for the other person to decode what they actually mean, and it's not very attention grabbing. And the psychologists began to call this behavior pattern hinting and hoping. So this is a status effect, it's a group behavior effect that's influencing the behavior here. The less senior person does not want to challenge, is not confident, is not assertive, but thinks there's something wrong, is trying to give the message, but is doing it in a very unassertive way. And when I first began to look at this crew resource management training they were getting, I remember going to London to British Airways, who were good enough to let me visit and talk to me about this training they were doing. And they were telling me they were doing all this assertiveness training. I was very surprised because we were running assertiveness training in the business school at the time for women returners. And it didn't seem to be, if you watched pilots at Heathrow marching about the airport very confidently, this didn't look, and they're nearly all men in those days, didn't really look like assertiveness training was something that they were much needing. But in fact, what they were doing in their non-technical training was picking up on these data patterns to address this strategy for reducing the risk of error. And not only do you have to teach the co-pilots to be assertive, but you'd also have to teach the captains to listen and to listen out for the clues that somebody's trying to tell you something. And now what they have are specific phraseology that they teach to get attention and to escalate your concern. And I see them teaching this now to surgeons because they ran studies in the surgical simulators. I remember they ran a study on one of the Harvard simulators. They got the senior person to make very bad decisions, and they watched how long it was for the more junior one to challenge. And they said the data were really horrible because they had to wait ages before the challenge came, by which time the patient would probably be dead. Fortunately, it was a simulator. So that this was moving from domain to domain. And many of us may have been in these situations where you think a senior person is making a mistake, but you're not quite sure, and you don't want to do a big challenge. So my point here is, in aviation, there was this very nice building psychological research looking at the evidence, the scientific evidence for these behavior patterns and why they would contribute to catching errors, making things safer, or why they would make the flight riskier. And we see this now. This is the Air France, much more recent accident. 10 years ago, crashes between Rio and Paris. They have no idea what happens till they get hold of the voice recording. Everybody has been killed because the plane plunges, big modern aircraft plunges out of control into the Atlantic, but they get hold eventually of the voice recording, and it's very, very interesting. I'm sure many of you have seen the story or the reenactments, and I won't go into the detail, but one of the things that happened is the pilots seem to become startled and surprised by the lack of control, and the co-pilot who's flying starts to do all the wrong things at that point, which makes the situation worse. But part of their evidence gathering here shows that in the accident analysis, there's something to do with the pilots becoming suddenly very surprised to the point of being startled, which is a more fearful reaction. And what do? They start commissioning research into this so that they can understand what's going on here, because they need the evidence to start building guidance to the airlines for pilots getting training to try and reduce the effects if they get into one of these startle surprise situations. So what happens, I think, which is good in aviation, which is a my kind of motto here is that they identify a problem at the top, and then they do this work. They analyze, they gather all this data, voice recordings, other kinds of data, to work out what are these behaviours, what are these skills, and on the basis of that evidence at the bottom, they design the training. And what I see happening in other industries, I could mention the oil industry and I could mention healthcare, is this. So we have a problem. Ooh, patient safety. 1 in 10 patients in the UK are having an adverse event, some of whom are being killed in the process. Or, you know, we have some huge accident in the oil industry, and there's clearly something going on. It might be something to do with teamwork or human behaviour. So what do? Well, we just buy in some training. We buy in some team training. We get some airline pilots, because the pilots do all this stuff. So we buy some pilots in to do this CRM training, which is quite a good idea, but it's not such a good idea as doing the work to gather the data to work out what are the behaviours and skills for your environment, for your conditions, for your people, for your culture. Of course, everybody needs decision making and teamwork and situational awareness, but what does it look like in your domain? How's it customized? So the CRM work goes on in aviation. In Europe, it's just been reviewed recently. So they not only put the stuff in place, but every few years they go back and they continue to gather evidence, and then they change the training. So this is a book that came out in February this year. I was asked to write a chapter about European pilots, which meant reading European aviation legislation, which is not a source of literature I recommend as an easy or light read. But anyway, they've got all this massive evidence now across the industry. They've got 9 basic competencies, and they're very interested in building resilience for pilots, particularly flying these great big huge aircraft that travel these really long distances now that are very complex and very automated, that the pilots can cope with surprises and unexpected things and still have the skills to think their way through. So that's aviation, and I said I would talk about some other industries. What about healthcare? I mentioned healthcare, and about, I can't remember, I'm so old now I get confused and everything telescopes. I think maybe about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we began in a number of countries, the USA, UK, other European countries, elsewhere, to realise that there was a bit of a patient safety problem. And I mentioned these figures about estimates of 8 to 10% of hospital admissions having some kind of adverse event. Some of these are fatal, and some of these are very minor. So you might get the wrong drug and nothing happens, or you might get the wrong drug and it kills you. And it may not, it may have been possible to prevent that happening. And so concern was raised. We ran a small study in Scotland, which showed, I'm afraid, it had about the same rates as we were seeing south of the border. And what began to happen is, first of all, this is probably 1990s now, 2000, we're starting to see a lot of media attention. And one of the areas that people started to look at was operating theatres, operating rooms. And the question was kind of posed, would this work on non-technical skills be relevant in that setting? We began first to work with anaesthetists. I think we started I can't remember now, it's so long ago. In the 1990s, we started to work with anaesthetists in the first simulation centre in Scotland. And I won't go through all this work, but there was starting to be evidence would build by the late 90s. This was the beginning of psychologists being invited in, or I think maybe allowed in is probably a better description, into operating theatres to start to watch what was going on. And the very first patient safety simulators began to be introduced at that time, operating theatre simulators. And the data, I'm not going to go through all these studies, but there was evidence started to build pretty quickly that where there were good non-technical skills, this was protective, this was good for efficiency and for patient safety. And when things went wrong for patients in operating theatres and elsewhere in hospitals, if you looked not very hard, you would soon see issues to do with leadership failures, poor decision making, lack of situation awareness, people not thinking about the risks properly, all that stuff that we were seeing in aviation 20 years earlier. Of course, because they're humans in the workplace, and they're affected by exactly the same things as the pilots were. And we, as I said, began to work with anaesthetists in Scotland who were based in Stirling at the first clinical simulation centre, who heard about this work on non-technical skills and said, oh, we could maybe use some of this. The reason they were interested, because they were trying to debrief teams in the operating theatre or the anaesthetic room in the simulations, and they said, we're really great at debriefing the technical stuff. We can say, wrong tube, should have been 4 mils, should have been positioned that way. But then there was all this other stuff about how they were thinking about the task, how they were communicating, how they were making decisions or not making decisions when they should. And they said, we have no consistent language for doing this. Of course, they have anaesthetists and many other professionals have no training in psychology whatsoever. They were having no training in these days in patient safety or human error. So how would they have had a common language? And we began to work with them to do what had been done in aviation, is to do the basic evidence gathering research and identify the non-technical skill sets. So we made these booklets. This is the one for anaesthetists. And if anybody's interested, I can send you these, because we made them freely available. I'm just going to describe a little bit of what we did in these studies. So there was a whole slew of work doing task analysis, working in this case with surgeons, identifying the behaviours, getting them to come up, of course, with what the behaviours were, and then doing reliability testing. And a lot of what we were doing was based on interviews. So this is a little snippet from some surgeons' interview data. This is surgeons saying, we're actually looking at scrub nurses' skills here, scrub nurses working with surgeons. Your surgeon's saying, if I'm concentrating hard, I'll forget the instruments I use every day, I forget the names of the instruments. This is what they like. A lot of what you need arrives in your hand without actually having got as far as asking for it. It's almost telepathy. Surgeons really like this when they don't have to ask, and a very good scrub nurse who's thinking ahead of the surgeon knows exactly what instrument is required and shoves it in their visual field so they can just take hold of it. And also saying that scrub nurses need to be quite focused and not be distracted. So they've got views on the behavior. We're looking for these behaviours here. We're looking for these thinking skills and the team skills. And this is nurses talking about surgeons now. So this is a nurse saying you can just know when something's going wrong. It's either you can physically see that something's happened, but sometimes you can't see. You can just recognize the surgeon's body language or see them clenching their jaw and knowing that things aren't going well. What we're trying to do is look at all that subtle expertise that experienced people build up, because this will let us know what these skill sets are. This is another nurse saying, when surgeons ask for something and you give them what you think it is that they need, it's not the thing they said, but you know that's what they actually want. It's a little bit convoluted, but she's saying here the same thing as the surgeon is saying. And there's another nurse saying, the surgeon said, give me the buzzy thing, because the surgeon has forgotten the name of the thing that is required, but luckily the nurse knows what the buzzy thing is. So we had hours and hours of these interviews that we would go through systematically, line by line, identifying everything that was a behaviour or a thinking skill or a team skill, and then we would go through all the stuff we extracted in a great long process with panels of surgeons or panels of scrub nurses and ODPs to get them to tell us what were the really key behaviours and what did it look like if that behaviour was good and what did it look like if that behaviour was poor. And from these, we would build these non-technical skill set with these categories and then the component elements, and then we would get information about, as I say, what did it look like when it was good and what does it look like when it's not so good. So this is surgeons telling us, what does it look like if you're watching another surgeon and they're gathering information well? These are the kind of things I expect to see, because we're trying to build observational behaviour rating tools. And what does it look like if I think, that surgeon's not gathering the information very well? And of course, they've got the technical expertise to understand the meaning of what's being done. These are all in the booklets if anybody's interested. And then we made these rating, because what we wanted as in aviation was not only design the training, but design a means of assessment and feedback. You won't be able to see this, but we took the language from aviation, and it doesn't just say this is good performance or this is nice performance or we don't like the look of this so much. It says this behaviour could endanger patient safety, or this behaviour could enhance patient safety. And that's the kind of extreme. So it's not about whether you like the behaviour or whether you think it's pleasant or polite. It's whether this is a behaviour that's increasing risk in the situation for the patient or a behaviour that's making it safer for the patient. And that was kind of the bottom line. We ran studies, we made videos with operating theatre staff, and we played the videos, and we trained surgeons who would only give us little tiny amounts of their time, but we managed to get them to do about 2 hours training. We'd like to have had them for 2 days, but we were doing well to recruit them for 2 hours to learn a little bit about the system and then watch tapes with surgeons acting out good or poor non-technical skills and then seeing if they could identify and rate them. And from this work, we developed a tool, same as the one for anaesthetists, but this was the tool for surgeons called NOTS here. And we also did some other little bits of work trying to, as they've done in aviation, trying to get behind some of these skills. Clearly, making decisions while you're operating is very important, but there was hardly any literature on this. Surgeons write a lot about the technical aspects of decision making, and they write a lot about what they do before they go to surgery, but studying what goes on while they're in the middle of it, particularly if it doesn't go to plan, was far less literature on this. This is a quote from a video recording of some surgeons who were actually looking at leadership, but there's this great quote on decision making here. It's a consultant surgeon talking to the trainee surgeon, saying, "Where's the hole? Can you see it? Well, that's no good. If you can't see the whole hole, we can't repair it, can we? If you can't see it, we have to put the clamp on. Another vascular clamp, please. Right. Think. Let's just think here." This all started off so nicely, didn't it? It was all going very smoothly. It was probably quite an automatic, straightforward procedure. And now something's gone wrong, either because somebody has cut something that wasn't supposed to, or something looks different. Sometimes they get in and the anatomy is not what they're expecting. But what's interesting us here is this senior surgeon telling the junior surgeon, we need to move from a faster, automatic mode of decision making into a slower, more analytic style. And our interest in this was reinforced by a Canadian surgeon who did some very nice work for a PhD and wrote papers called Slowing Down When You Should, and realizing that the senior expert recognizes the cue that tells you when you should slow down. Some of you may have read the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, and that's what this is all about. Anyway, a flavour of little bits of research underneath it. NOTS has gone pretty well global. We've had people, whether they're using it, these are just people requesting it, but we know it's being trialled in other places. It's been put into the professional standards in Australia. It's been translated into Japanese and some other languages. And I was in Edinburgh at the College of Surgeons about 3 weeks ago at a workshop which had Scottish surgeons from Harvard, who are now very involved in this, because our postdoc from this project, the lecturer who was on it, went to Harvard from Aberdeen and now works with surgeons. And they had a group of surgeons from Africa, mainly from Rwanda, who are teaching this now in Rwanda. And it's being taught in some other African countries. And I was very surprised when the surgeons said, oh, the African surgeons really they want more NOTS materials, they want the stuff for the training courses. And I said, if you're in these resource-limited countries where you don't have enough, you don't have operating theatres, never mind the kit, never mind anything else, it's impressive that they want to do this training. And apparently the African surgeon said, but because we have such limited resources, we have to get it right first time. We really can't afford unnecessary errors because the aftercare is completely limited or non-existent. No high dependency unit, no intensive care, relatives taking patients home who've just been operated on, no resource to bring people back into theatre and have another look or do a bit of a patch up or whatever could be done in a very a resourceful environment like ours. So it's been interesting seeing their rationale, all to do with error management, and understanding that this was about anything that would help them reduce error was going to be worth spending their time on. Okay, we've done this for scrub practitioners, we've done this for anaesthetic nurses, and then just to say a little bit to finish about offshore. So we began to work after Piper Alpha on a number of projects, and one of the projects we worked on was, because I had seen this crew resource management stuff, we got some funding to trial this out for offshore, but this didn't go terribly well. It kind of just landed nowhere at the time. And I don't know whether this was maybe because we were psychologists and we should have involved more technical people, and there was always a bit of an issue about us being seen as psychiatrists, despite my endlessly explaining that we were not going to offer anybody psychotherapy and there were no Freudian analysts. I spent a lot of time once checking an article that was being written for an in-house magazine on one of our safety projects we were running out of the business school in the 90s, and I checked all to make sure it didn't sound in the least psychoanalytic. And then I opened the magazine and I saw this picture illustrating our story with 3 North Sea tiger oilmen on the psychiatrist's couch, which was just precisely the image in those days in the 1990s. We were just trying to avoid them taking away, but there was no, so anyway, so nobody's very interested in this and they think we're psychiatrists. And then this happens. Macondo, Deepwater Horizon. I'll not go through it all, but this accident, by now, the lawyers, the regulators, we all know about culture, we know about non-technical skills, and these questions get asked very quickly now in the investigations. So this is a paper by 2 of my former PhD students who are now elsewhere, analysing all the stuff in Macondo. We see the Chemical Safety Board, United States, arguing, oh, need for development of non-technical skills, including decision-making, blah, blah, blah. So the oil industry were very receptive to the things the regulators were saying post-Macondo, and we got some funding from the oil and gas, one of the oil and gas, it's gone out the top of my head, professional groups to look at well operations, crew resource management from IOGP. And I'll not go through it all, but we were also doing work. This is work that Ruby Roberts, who's now in the business school here as a postdoc, was doing, studying drillers' situational awareness. Again, this kind of thing hadn't been studied in this industry, but we've got simulators, and we have a simulator here at RGU. We were using the Maersk simulator in Denmark for this work. But the simulators, again, can tell us all kinds of things about how are they thinking their way through the problems. This is a model she devised, trying to, based on work in aviation, but trying to look at all the components of what's going on in the driller's head when the driller is trying to do well control. So reports came out on that. And now the oil industry is bringing in, particularly for well control and drilling, we see these courses, and the simulator centres are running them, and there's some of this work going on here with training that's run at RGU. So lots of people are now using CRM, non-technical skills, the rail industry, construction industry, the Navy, it's mandated for officers. It offers a number of things here, focus on behaviour, particularly focus on cognition, which doesn't get studied so often, the thinking skills. Lots of people have teamwork training, but actually trying to study decision-making and situation awareness. It gives these frameworks, it provides the common language that the anaesthetists were looking for, lots of different applications, including for accident analysis. So you want to work out what's gone wrong. You want to not just look at the technical bits of what happened, but the non-technical. And at best, it's informed by psychological research on behaviour. And I'll just finish with 3 slides on the latest bit of work. I'm not going to go through it, but just this is new work that we're doing now. And it's kind of been driven by the interest in the psychological work that's been done in safety in the North Sea. So David Miller at the Oil and Gas Technology Centre saw the relevance of actually bringing in psychologists to look at the adoption of new technology, particularly the psychological barriers or facilitators that would encourage or suppress new technologies coming in. And Ruby Roberts, who did the work with the drillers, is working as a postdoc on this new project we've got running for 2 years. This is what's in the literature from the oil and gas industry. These are professional bodies or the Wood Review. Lots of stuff about the industry maybe being a bit risk averse. People don't want to be the early adopters, but they want to be fast followers. They want another company to try it because the risks of getting things wrong are not good. And so there may be some things that are just common to any industry, and there may be some things that relate to the oil industry. And this is what we're doing, done a literature review. Not much literature on these psychological factors, particularly in offshore oil. There's lots written about new technology, and there's amazing new technologies coming into the offshore oil industry. We've done interviews. We're going to do some case studies, and we're trying to build some tools. And the interviews, you probably can't read this, but we are beginning to pick up quite a lot of psychological stuff about why people are either receptive to new technologies, or are they averse to risk and they don't like change and they're worried about their jobs, or they think they won't get rewarded for it, or they don't actually trust it, or they don't trust their managers, or they don't trust the supplier, or their peer group don't like. All sorts of factors that I think haven't really been looked at in any depth, we are starting to work on here. So it's a different example of bringing psychology into the world of work, but for us it's going to be many of the same things as we've looked at before. So if you're interested in any more information, this is my email. If you want any of these booklets, just email me and I can send you a copy. And thank you very much for your attention.